guys, you are the Abriah Serenity. I'm back at you with another video, and this video is going to be a bit controversial. I came to ruffle some feathers. I came to ruffle some feathers and cause some uproar in the body of Christ, all in the name of the Lord, all for good cause, all for good reasons, because I want y'all to be free. I want y'all to be knowledgeable. I want you to be aware. I want you to be free. And with that being said, I would like to open up this discussion with the scripture from Isaiah chapter 44, verse 9, where it says, "All who make idols are nothing, and the things they treasure are worthless. Those who would speak up for them are blind. They are ignorant to their own shame." I'm going to say it again. All who make idols are nothing, and the things they treasure, heavy on the word treasure, are worthless, worthless. Those who would speak up for them, are blind. They are ignorant to their own shame. We're just going to leave that there for a minute before we get into everything. I would just like to say, I came to deliver the facts. I came here to deliver scripture. I came here to give you interp. I came here to give you explanation and history, all in one. And I also would just like to say your feelings about what I'm teaching are not my problem. Not my problem. That's just not my problem. What? Not my problem. That's just not my problem. Take it to the Lord. Not my problem. Not my problem. Now, I also made a video stating that my marriage license was demonic, that it was indeed demonic, and showed you guys what was on the marriage license, what that means, and how it was a demonic contract that was absent of God, that had absolutely nothing to do with God, and people tried to rationalize and reason even with facts and proof in their face. Where did marriage licenses come from? And why are they not discussed in the Bible? Marriage licenses aren't discussed in the Bible, but we all know that marriage licenses are a real thing. Marriage licenses did not exist in biblical times because marriage licenses were not created until the colonial period. They were created by the Church of England. Before then, marriages were private contractual agreements between man, woman, God, and their families, and whatever witnesses were a part of that process. They had their own process. They had their own way of drawing up documents, their own agreements, their own prenuptial agreements, etc., etc. They had all of that, but it did not involve the government. It did not involve the state. So if marriage licenses are demonic and they have absolutely nothing to do with God, why then do marriage licenses exist? So glad you asked. Marriage licenses started as a business. They saw an opportunity to capitalize off the people and get more money and create a stream of revenue. It had nothing to do with the benefit of the people. It had nothing to do with God. It had everything to do with them capitalizing off of marriage. They saw marriage, they saw divorce, and they saw a booming business. They are making money off you regardless if you're going to get a marriage license or you're getting a divorce. It is a constant, continuous cycle that's keeping money in their pocket. It has nothing to do with God. Nothing at all. Church of England, priests, bishops, and other non-religious clergy had substantial say in authorizing marriages from this point forward. You now had to get permission from the state to get married. You now had to pay them to get married. You needed them to authorize it. Otherwise, it was invalid. Otherwise, they didn't acknowledge it. And when they did this, the church's influence was tampered with. Influence of the church when it came to marriages at this point was lessened. Because now it was more so about business than it was about God. They involved themselves in the private affairs of the people. An institution that was between a man, woman, and God. They involved themselves in that and turned it into a business. They created a bunch of secular laws regarding marriage licensing that forced people to comply. They told you if you don't have a marriage license, you can't do this, you can't get that, you can't get the benefits of this. They made it so that you had to have a marriage license, or you had to have a marriage license in England. This is just in England. This isn't even the US yet. Okay? This ain't even the US. This is just England. This is just the origin story. This is the villain origin story. Okay, this is where it was conceptualized. This is where it came from. And you guys need to know this. Again, it has absolutely nothing to do with God. Everything to do with the state and their need to capitalize and have jurisdiction over the people. These were private and contractual. That means it didn't involve the government. It was something that you and your husband, you and your wife contracted up. Your families came together and created a contract and registered it. You did not have to go to Pharaoh. You did not have to go to Caesar. You did not have to go to kings or queens outside of Israel to be married or have permission. You did not need permission to get married. You only needed to discuss things with between your families and draw up your own contracts. It was a private contractual agreement that did not involve a non-religious entity. And that is why this is not talked about in the Bible, because these marriage licenses didn't even exist in this time. Marriage licenses did not exist in the Bible. They had contracts, but that's not the same. Private contracts and marriage licenses are not the same. A license, you need permission. When you have a driver's license, you need permission to drive. When you get a marriage license, you need permission from the state to marry. Those are not talked about in the Bible because they didn't exist. They didn't exist. Marriage licenses did not exist. That is also another reason why you don't see these counterfeit marriages that I'm referring to in the Bible, because they did not exist. They were not created until the colonial period, which is way after the Bible was written. Fact check it. Clock it. Now you guys remember why Jesus was upset when he went into the temple. Okay, the book of Matthew, chapter 21, verse 12. It says, then Jesus went into the temple of God and drove out all of those who bought and sold in the temple. All those who bought and sold. So if they turned marriage into a business, wouldn't that make Jesus upset? Every time you go into the church with your marriage license to get ordained by these licensed ministers who have to report to the state, every time you register your marriage license, the state collects money. All those who bought and sold in the temple, that would make Jesus mad. These marriage licenses are not of God. Jesus went into the temple of God and drove out all those who bought and sold. Bought and sold. So the church and state who was involved in this business and using God's temple as a form of a transaction for a marriage license, he is not pleased. He said to them, it is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves. The state is stealing from y'all and finessing y'all, and y'all don't even know. And they're using the church to do it. And fooling y'all and saying, oh, these licenses, they're of God. They represent God is happy with these. He's not. These marriage licenses, this business they started, turned the Lord's house of prayer into a den of thieves. They are using the church to do business transactions with the state. Clock it. Clock it. We ain't even got to the racist part yet. If you need to pause and go get a drink, go ahead, do that. But yeah, clock this, clock this. Clock it. Now let's talk about how these marriage licenses in the United States are rooted in racism. We have already talked about the origins of the marriage license that started in the Church of England, that was started as a business to collect a stream of revenue from the people for the state, not for the betterment of the people. And they used the church to conduct business transactions between the people and the state. Okay, turning the Lord's house into a den of thieves. All right, started a business and involved themselves in the private affairs that did not involve them to capitalize on marriage and divorce. When the Pilgrims came to America, they did not have judicial control over marriage. They did not have marriage licensing. You didn't have to go to them to get permission to get married. You just got married. But it wasn't until 1741 in North Carolina that they took judicial control over all marriages. And the primary reason for that was because of interracial marriage. They wanted to stop whites from marrying black. They wanted to stop whites from marrying Native Americans. They created laws to stop people from getting married. And if you got married outside of your race, they punished you, they killed you, they put you in prison. They created the most ridiculous laws and made it extremely difficult for you to get a marriage license if you were trying to marry somebody outside of your race. That was the primary reason for marriage licenses in the United States. That is why they made it a thing. It wasn't even for business. It wasn't even about business. It was about them trying to preserve their whiteness. Eugenics and things of that nature. The U.S. government took judicial control in order to involve branches of government that are responsible for trying cases that only involve the government and the administrative of justice in personal and private affairs that originally did not involve them, in order to stop interracial marriages and maintain racial purity. They wanted to maintain racial purity. They did not want to taint their bloodline. So they created these laws and these marriage licenses to keep people from getting married outside of their race. And if you did get married outside of your race, they created laws to punish you, to make it harder for you to do so. It was all about racial purity. It was never about God. Once again, this has absolutely nothing to do with God. Knowing your history is important. So although they took judicial control over all marriages, the Racial Integrity Act was not passed until 1924. So that outlawed interracial marriage and added strict definitions to racial classifications. Those rules where you gotta be 1/8 black or 1/14 or whatever, that's where that came from. That came from the Racial Integrity Act. And it was created by somebody named Walter Ashby Pleaker, who was a white supremacist that loved eugenics, who was an OBGYN. He also was an OBGYN, so I can only imagine the weird stuff he was doing. I can only imagine. He only gave marriage licenses to those they deemed were acceptable. And you can imagine how that went. Okay? By the 1920s, more than 38 states in the US had crafted similar policies and laws to promote and maintain racial purity. Marriage licenses was about racial purity, trying to maintain racial purity. We're going to create these laws. We're going to force you to get our permission to get married. Marriage is for whites. Keep it pure, or you're going to go to jail. Whether you're white or black. If you were white, of course you would go to jail. Your sentence would be way less than that of a black person or a Native American. And it wasn't, at first it was just white and black. They're like, we don't want you to marry black. But then they extended it and they said, we don't want you to marry Native Americans either. We don't want you to marry Native Americans. We don't want you to marry black. We don't want you to marry anybody that's not white. Also look up the case Lovings versus Virginia. I actually think they made a movie about that. I think they actually made a movie about Lovings in Virginia some years ago. I know it was in the 2000s, like they made a movie about that. I don't know if I ever watched it, but Lovings versus Virginia is a case between the Lovings. One man, he was white, his wife was black and Native American. They wanted to get married, and they left Virginia to go to Washington, D.C. to get married. And then they came back to Virginia. They found out that they was married and they put them in jail. Because the U.S. has jurisdiction over these marriages and judicial control, they can control you, they can control your spouse, they can control your property. They say what you can and cannot do with your property because you entered a business with them the moment you got that marriage license and registered it with the state. You gave them permission to be involved in your marital affairs. That is why divorce is so messy. Why do you think it costs so much money to get a divorce? It's not just about separating from that person. It's about them collecting a bunch of money. You also had a contractual agreement with the state to do business with them. And now you're saying, I don't want to do business with them no more. So now they're saying, okay, you got to pay us to get out of this contract. You got to pay us to file these papers. You got to pay all these fees. You got to pay our attorneys. Even though they're going to represent you, they still work for us. You want out of this business, you're going to have to pay the piper. You pay the piper, and then we're going to tell you what you can and cannot do with your kids. We're going to tell you how much money you got to pay. We're going to tell you where you can go, where you can't go. They still have control and jurisdiction over you. It was never about God. It was about business. It was about capitalism. It was about racism. It was about control. It's about a never-ending cycle of misfortune. Marriage license has nothing to do with God, even if it's officiated by a pastor. And I'm going to tell you why. Because the pastor then involves the state by acting as an agent of the state. Okay, they are an agent of the state. They are not representing God when they marry you. They are representing the state. Try going to a church and asking a pastor to marry you without a marriage license. Most of them will turn you away. Most of them will turn you away. Okay? They have to report to the state. There aren't a lot of pastors that will marry you without a marriage license. Even if you draw up your own contracts, they still be like, nah, I don't want to do that. Find somebody else to do it. They're going to be like, find somebody else to do it. Pastors that are licensed to be in that church, they have to answer to the state and not God when it comes to marriage licenses. They have to report to their local registrar in the district in which they live. There are different laws for different states. Okay, the marriage license and certificate must be completed by the minister and returned to the county clerk within 30 days after the marriage. Okay, they have their own laws and regulations. Denominations such as the United Methodist Church have a book of discipline and ways of doing things that all denominations don't do things the same way. But most of them have that same requirement. If you get married in their church, you have to have a marriage license from the state. Now, politics and business transactions happening within the church. Okay? And there was a time where the government had no business involving themselves in his temple, because his temple, it was written, shall be a house of prayer, not a den of thieves. The church is very much so involved with the state and doing business with the state, even though they should not be. Still very heavily involved in politics in ways that we should not be involved, to the point where a lot of churches are afraid to speak out about real world problems, because they don't want any issues with the government. They don't want any issues with some of their political members of the church. They don't want the ties to stop. They don't want political members to walk out because they don't agree with the people they want to vote for, and all other types of controversial things, regardless if they're blatantly wrong or it's right. There's a lot of politics and business transactions happening in the church today that have nothing to do with God. Have a lot of business transactions, a lot of political, a lot of messy stuff happening in the church. Not all churches. That does not mean you should not go to church, but I'm just saying, do your research. Do your research on these churches. Do these research on these churches, especially the mega churches. Like, you can get married without involving the state, okay, and giving them jurisdiction over your marriage. You can. You do not have to get a marriage license. There is a way to do this. You can draw up your own contract. You can draw up your own contractual agreement, even a prenuptial agreement, in the event something happens to this marriage. Say this person commits adultery or fornicates, and they basically like spit on the covenant that you have with God. There is an agreement in fine print in that contract that says, okay, if you do X, Y, and Z, X, Y, and Z is going to happen, and you guys both sign it, notarize it, the pastor or whoever officiates it between you, God, and your husband or your wife, and it's just as good as any other marriage license that you have without involving the state. You can still have prenuptial agreements for protection. You can still keep track of your records. You're just not going into business with the state, and you're keeping the state out of your private affairs. You can still have a trust. You can still have all these things. You're just keeping them out of your business, because they have no business with things of God. Okay, they have no business trying to capitalize off an institution of marriage. A lot to dissect. I know this was a lot. There's a lot of things you're going to have to go back and research. A lot of things you're going to have to go back and fact check. But, you know, drop your comments in the comment section. Let's talk about it, y'all. Let's talk about what you think. Let's talk about what's going on in your brain after watching this. It's probably overwhelming. I know. My name is Abriah Serenity, and if you have made it all the way to the end of this video, I thank you so much for watching it to its full completion. If you feel led by the Holy Spirit, click that like and subscribe button and turn on those notifications so you don't miss any more uploads from me. I love you all with the love of the Lord, and I'll see you guys next time.